I have been to Paris twice. The first time I was 18 years old, poor in every measurable sense, and so completely, recklessly alive that I barely noticed. The second time was 2017, alone, pre-COVID, with a good hotel and no plan and nowhere I had to be. 2 trips separated by almost 2 decades. Paris meets you exactly where you are. Whatever I brought to it, the city reflected back in that particular shimmering light that somehow makes you want a girlfriend, a cigarette, or a reason to stay another week. Welcome to Zenieth Massif. Think of us as a concierge of new perspective, the stories and adventures that hide in plain sight, the investment of an unacquired taste. I am your host, and today we are talking about Paris just a little bit. When I was 18, Paris was not a destination, it was a dare. 2 of us, fresh out of high school, convinced ourselves we had to go. We had almost nothing. We stayed as cheap as we could find, and when I say cheap, I mean the kind of room where our bed shared the same room as our toilet. We made peace with this quickly, we had no other option. What I remember most from that trip is not a monument, not the Eiffel Tower, though we stood under it until our necks hurt. What I remember is the contrast, the total, almost comedic gap between the room we were sleeping in and the city that waited every morning outside the door. We were staying somewhere that could be generously described as humble. And out there, Paris was doing what Paris always does, being magnificent, being indifferent to our budget, spreading its boulevards and its cafes and its impossible light over absolutely everyone with exactly the same generosity. No cover charge, no dress code, just the city doing its thing. We had saved somehow just enough for one Pierre Hermé cake. On the last night of that trip, 3 hours before Ryanair flight at some ungodly hour of the morning, we sat with that cake in that ranchy room, and Paris became, against all logic, beautiful. Pierre Hermé is the 4th generation of an Alsatian baking family who came to Paris at 14 to apprentice under the legendary Gaston Lenôtre. Vogue eventually called him the Picasso of pastry, which sounds like something invented by a press team but is actually accurate. He builds desserts from the inside out, structure first, decoration last, and only what's necessary. The result is pastry that operates at a level of sensory precision most food never reaches. The magic of the combination of sugar, fruit, and flowers, it hits differently when you're 18, and the rest of your situation is genuinely grim. That contrast, the ranchy room and the immaculate cake held inside one evening, gave Paris a dimension it would never have had if we'd been comfortable. The beauty was more beautiful because everything around it was so unglamorous. That's the secret the city keeps. It doesn't require luxury to do its work on you. It only requires that you show up. An artist has no home in Europe except in Paris. Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote that from the outside, looking in. He meant it as a statement about creative freedom. That Paris is the one city where ambition is not suspicious, where the pursuit of something beautiful is not an embarrassment. I was 18 and had no language for it yet, but I felt exactly what he meant. Standing on those boulevards in cheap clothes with a notebook and a hunger I couldn't quite name, nobody looked at me like I didn't belong. The city wanted me to be hungry for its beauty. That much I understood. There is a building at the edge of the Bois de Boulogne that I want to tell you about early, because it belongs in the same breath as ambition and beauty and the kind of thing Paris makes possible. The Fondation Louis Vuitton was designed by my former boss, Frank Gehry. The story begins in 2001 when Bernard Arnault, chairman of LVMH, visited the Guggenheim in Bilbao and met Gehry. He asked Frank to imagine a cultural institution for Paris, a gift to the city, at the edge of the Jardin d'Acclimatation. Frank visited the garden and was inspired by the old 19th century glass houses there, their lightness, their transparency, the sense of a building that breathes with the weather and the season. What he built is hard to describe without standing in front of it. 12 immense curved glass sails wrap around a white concrete core. From outside, it reads like a ship with its sails full of wind, rebellious and grand at the same time. I have stood on the roof terraces and watched Paris open below in every direction. There is no angle from which the building is modest. What I love about it is what I always loved about Frank's work. It refuses to apologize for its own ambition. It makes the cultural confidence of LVMH visible and then rises above it, a vessel for art, a building that is itself a piece of art, a gift that the city actually received. Take the shuttle from the Arc de Triomphe, arrive early, allow time on the terraces, and take the shuttle back. The walk through the Bois de Boulogne from the wrong direction adds 20 minutes you didn't plan for. We had been trying for days to get into a small neighborhood bistro near where we were staying. The first attempt, it was closed. That's Paris. The bistro closes when the bistro wants to close, and the bistro owes you nothing. So we returned on a rainy day, speaking zero French, navigating entirely by stubbornness and hunger. When we finally sat down and tried to order, pointing at things, doing our best, I made the mistake of suggesting to the owner how I would like my steak prepared. He gave me a look, a very specific look, a very French look, and then a single, firm, unambiguous sound that was not quite a word. It was a correction delivered without cruelty, but with complete authority. The steak would be how the steak would be. And that was the moment I understood something essential about this city. Paris is a place where people take pride in every corner, in every detail of what they do. The owner wasn't being rude. He was protecting the integrity of his work. And the steak, when it arrived, was beyond any steak I could have designed for myself. It was exactly right because he knew what exactly right meant, and I didn't. We ended the meal with a strawberry cold soup. I didn't know such a thing was possible. A dessert that arrives cold, built around the pure flavor of a summer strawberry, served in a bowl like a very quiet poem. That's Paris at its most characteristic. The surprise that isn't trying to surprise you. It's simply what happens when craft and conviction operate without apology, big and small. The second time I came to Paris with any real intention was 2017. I came alone, pre-COVID. The city was still itself, unself-conscious, unrehearsed, running on its own internal logic with no particular interest in whether I was following. Traveling alone in Paris is a specific experience I would recommend to everyone at least once. I had no one to negotiate with. I ate when I wanted, walked where I wanted, stood in front of things for as long as they held me. A complete submission. I am a tourist, show me the best Paris you can offer. I ordered the Parisian breakfast at the hotel every morning. This is one of the underrated pleasures of the city, and I want to make a case for it. The good version gives you raw milk cheese, smoked salmon, cultured butter, fresh bread, avocado, a spread that requires no improvement and asks nothing except that I slow down. It's a breakfast that educates on what a good butter should be. It says, today, pay attention. Paris in miniature, really. Every morning it said the same thing. At night I went to La Gare La Gore. This is in the northeastern part of the city, away from the monuments and the designer boutiques, in a neighborhood that feels like a different Paris entirely. The way I arrived already told me what was coming. The signs are hand-painted, the energy looser, the street announcing itself through graffiti and sound rather than clean facades. Inside La Gare La Gore, live jazz bands play through the evening without pause. Food trucks outside, locals gathering, genuinely local people, people for whom this is simply where they go on a Thursday. Nobody there for Instagram, everyone there for the music and each other. I sat outside with a beer and listened to a band play something I couldn't name and didn't need to. Nobody was performing for anyone. The music was happening because the music was happening. The crowd was there because the crowd wanted to be there. The city outside was doing whatever cities that all do at 10 on a Thursday night, and none of it had anything to do with being a tourist or following a recommendation or ticking something off. It was just alive, completely, carelessly alive. My advice, stay along the yellow metro line in the center. Proudly admit you're a tourist. Paris will receive you as one, and that's fine. But when there's a night with nothing planned, go northeast. Go where the signs are hand-painted. Go where the food trucks don't have a Michelin mention. That's where the other Paris lives, the one with no interest in whether you've arrived or not. And for an hour or two, I was not a tourist at all. That's the gift of going alone in 2017 to a city that old. Eventually, it stops performing for you and lets you swing with her. When good Americans die, they go to Paris. Oscar Wilde. Wilde said it as a joke. which is how he said everything important. But underneath the wit is a real idea. Paris as the reward, as the place you've earned, as the final destination of a life well and stylishly spent. He knew it personally. He died here, penniless, in a third-floor room at a small hotel on the left bank, age 46, having been imprisoned and exiled from the country that made him famous. He reportedly remarked on the room's wallpaper just before the end. Even then, he's buried at Père Lachaise, in a tomb with a winged figure inspired by his poem The Sphinx. For decades, visitors did something no other literary grave has inspired. They kissed it, in lipstick, thousands of kisses, accumulated over years, covering the stone in a dense archive of devotion. The problem was chemical. Grease from lipstick penetrates limestone. By 2011, the tomb was close to irreparable damage. A glass barrier went up. Now the kisses land on the glass. He would have found this funny. Stephen Fry, who played Wilde on screen, described the kissing tradition better than anyone. Here was a man, Fry said, who believed when he died that his name would be toxic for generations, that his work wouldn't be read, that he'd stand for nothing but disgrace, and his tomb in Père Lachaise had to be restored because the polished stone corroded through kissing. Thousands and thousands of kisses. If that's not the city being right about something, I don't know what is. I walk through Père Lachaise like a museum of how we remember. Tombs ranging from modest stones to structures so grand they're essentially small buildings. Each one a different answer to the same quiet question. I was here. Did it matter? Edith Piaf is buried here. Marcel Proust, Jim Morrison, every tomb a story, every story the same story. Everyone knows the Louvre pyramid. What most people don't know is the specific obsession behind it. Before the pyramid, the Louvre had no front door. Visitors arrived at one of the world's great museums and immediately got lost. No central gathering point, no clear way to find companions, no orientation before the collection swallowed you. I. M. Pei, the Chinese-American architect commissioned by President Mitterrand in 1983, saw a practical problem. His solution was radical. Dig a giant hole in the center of the Cour Napoleon, build a hall underground, and mark the entrance with a glass pyramid. Ancient form, modern material, dropped into the heart of a Renaissance palace. But here's the part I want our listeners to know. The insider scoop. Pei was obsessed, completely, almost impossibly obsessed, with the glass being transparent. Standard glass at the time had a slight blue or green tint. Pei found this unacceptable. He wanted the pyramid to be nearly invisible, to be there and not there at the same time. After months of research, his team worked with the French glass company Saint-Gobain to develop a new kind of glass entirely, extra clear, made using white sand from the forest of Fontainebleau, then polished in England to eliminate any surface distortion. They produced enough for 2 pyramids, just in case. When I stand inside the Louvre and look up through it, I am essentially looking at the sky through nothing. The maestro signed off. When it opened in 1989, the criticism was ferocious. One member of the Académie Française wrote simply, "Poor France." Others called it a foreign body, a disregard for history. The same rage, I should note, that originally greeted the Eiffel Tower as useless and monstrous. Paris has a habit of hating its masterpieces first and loving them later with equal intensity. The Louvre went from 3.5 million visitors the year the pyramid opened to over 10 million within a decade. The entrance worked, the problem was solved, and the pyramid became improbably one of the great symbols of the city it was accused of violating. The Louvre deserves its own episode for all its glory, all its transformation, all the great art. To be alone in the Louvre, just once, with the art and silence as companions, is on my bucket list. There is no better starting point. If you want to meet the Paris that lives in your head, the imagined city, the one you've been carrying since the first film, or the first sentence of a book that placed you there, you begin at the Champs-Élysées. I walked that boulevard and something happened to my body. My stride widened, my shoulders dropped. Paris gives you a kind of pride simply for being in it. The air of a city where people have been romanticizing themselves and each other with an almost delusional density for several centuries, and it is contagious. Even if I arrived a skeptic, which I did not. Paris is organized by arrondissements, districts spiraling outward from the center. But what I noticed before I understood the numbers was the geometry. Wide, straight boulevards radiating outward in star formations, lined with identical limestone facades and rows of plane trees, magnificent to walk. Also, at its origins, a military calculation. The man responsible is Baron Haussmann, appointed by Napoleon III in 1853 to remake the city. Paris at the time was a labyrinth of narrow medieval streets, dark, crowded, and from Napoleon III's perspective, ideal for rebellion. The barricades of Les Miserables were built in exactly those kinds of streets. A narrow alley with furniture across it could hold off an army. The emperor wanted no more narrow alleys. Haussmann demolished around 20,000 buildings. He admitted in his own memoirs that his new Boulevard Sebastopol achieved what he called the gutting of old Paris, of the quarter of riots and barricades. The wide boulevards couldn't be blocked. They were sized for cavalry. They connected railway stations to contested neighborhoods, so troops could arrive quickly. The whole thing was engineered for control. The supreme irony is that those boulevards, built to suppress street life, to give the state a clear line of fire, became the defining stage for the most celebrated street culture in the world. The café terrace, the Sunday promenade, the evening walk. Napoleon III built a city to control his people and inadvertently handed the world the place everyone dreams about. Next time you walk those boulevards, remember, the grandeur was designed to suppress you, and somehow it only ever made you want to linger. On that 2017 trip, alone and with nothing planned for a particular afternoon, I found myself at the Bourse de Commerce, the old grain exchange, later the Commodities Exchange, now the Pinot Collection Museum, renovated by Tadao Ando. I went without booking tickets online, which I was meant to do. At the ticket desk, I explained I was an architect and asked if there was any possibility of getting in that day. They let me in without hesitation. I won't call it a trick, but for all Paris's reputation for guarding its culture jealously, and it does guard it, there's a generosity in the city's institutions toward genuine curiosity that I have found again and again. They let me in. That was worth applauding. The Bourse is a circular 18th century building with a spectacular iron and glass dome and murals covering the upper walls. Ando's solution was this. He inserted a concrete cylinder, a 29-meter wide drum rising inside the historic shell directly beneath the dome. It sounds confrontational. In practice, it's the most respectful thing he could have done. It gives the art a neutral surface without competing with what was already there. The frescoes remain, the staircases remain, the dome remains. Ando's cylinder simply arrives as a new layer, the way Paris has always received new layers, without erasing what came before. Old and new in the same room, across centuries without apology. That's Ando's signature. And if you think about it, it's also the thesis of the entire city. I have stood under the Eiffel Tower twice, once at 18, once in 2017, and both times I was not prepared for it. It's so large, so entirely itself, that the body responds before the mind does. What I felt is not quite the sublime, it's something more collective. The feeling of a shared memory made physical. This structure, called useless and monstrous when it went up for the 1889 World's Fair, is now the most photographed monument in the world. No longer the tallest building anywhere. Doesn't need to be. It belongs to everyone who has ever stood beneath it, from wherever they came. At 18, we stood under it and felt the togetherness of it, the way it pulled everyone in that plaza into a shared moment without asking. Two of us, looking up, not saying anything for a while. That was probably the first time in my life I understood what a shared experience actually felt like. Not something you describe to someone later, something that is only real while it's happening, with the people it's happening with. In 2017, I stood there alone, at dusk. Different feeling entirely. Not togetherness, continuity. All the people who had stood in this exact spot before me. All the people who will stand here after. If you are lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man, then wherever you go for the rest of your life, it stays with you. For Paris is a movable feast. Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway wrote that about being young and hungry and discovering that the city would feed you, not just with food, but with everything else. Friendship, argument, ambition, failure, the next draft, the next idea, the next morning with a cafe and a view of the Seine, a meal you carry with you, something that nourishes long after you've left the table. I was 18 when I first arrived. I had no money and no credentials and nothing to offer the city except my full attention. And it gave me something back that I still haven't finished unpacking. That's what a movable feast means. You don't eat it once and finish it. It travels with you. It keeps giving. My first Paris was before the iPhone, before GPS, before Uber, before the map in your pocket that recalculates when you take a wrong turn. We carried physical maps and wrote addresses in notebooks, where we were staying, so we could find our way home at night. Which train stop, which street, what the restaurant was called, and how to say it badly enough that someone might understand. There was a hunting and reward system in that kind of travel that the smartphone has mostly dissolved. I had to earn the destination. I navigated by approximation and by asking strangers who were sometimes patient and sometimes not. I got lost. I found things I hadn't planned for. The friction wasn't the problem. The friction was the experience. I was flipping through an old notebook recently and found the address of that first hotel, the one with the toilet in the bedroom, written in my own handwriting from almost 15 years ago. And something about seeing it there, in ink, on paper, the whole trip came back at once, not as memory, as sensation. The cold of the street outside the door, the sound of the city at 3 a.m., the particular weight of being 20 and lost in Paris and not minding at all. I had written the address down, which meant I had paid attention, and paying attention, it turns out, is how we make things last. We haven't talked about the Arc de Triomphe, about the Marais, about Saint-Germain-des-Prés, about the Seine at dusk, or the markets on Saturday morning, or what it feels like to sit in a cafe on a rainy afternoon with a book bought from one of the bouquinistes along the river. We haven't talked about Notre Dame, which is rebuilding. We haven't talked about Montmartre at 5 in the morning when the tourists are still asleep and the streets belong to nobody. Paris is probably 3 episodes, minimum. Today I just poured out my memories. What I want to leave with you is simple. I went at 18, poor but rich in heart. I went again in 2017, alone but completely free. 2 different people in the same city, 20 years apart, and Paris held both versions of me without flinching. It didn't ask me to be more than I was. It didn't ask me to be ready. It only asked me to be present, which is, when you think about it, the only thing it ever asks of anyone. Go with an open palate. Let the owner correct your steak order. Stand under the Eiffel Tower long enough for the lights to come on. Find the jazz. Eat the Hermé cake, especially if the rest of the day is not going to plan. And if you can, go alone once. Go with nothing you have to explain to anyone else. Let the city find you. It will. Paris always finds the people who are looking. Do you have a specific dessert you like? Is Paris on your list? Drop us a note. Every week, we dedicate an episode to your stories and your questions. We're building this map together. Until then, keep walking slowly.